Hey guys, hope you're doing well. Let's talk GT cars and let's talk specifically Porsche GT cars. They are all hallowed. If you do get yourself a build slot for one of these, it is absolute bragging rights down the pub. Oh yes, I got a GT car build slot. What about you? Yeah, really something to shout about. But could things be changing here? Could we be seeing a shift? Could even the GT car bubble be about to burst, or at least slowly pop? We're going to be digging into a few facts and figures during this video to understand just exactly what is going on here, because these cars have always held at their value really, really well. Or have they? Let's start with the GT4 RS. Now this car had a lot of hype around it when it dropped. Build slots were very limited. They were reserved for those folk who had a significant buying history with Porsche. Indeed, a lot of the GT cars, especially the RS variants, only reserved for those customers who have spent a lot of money with Porsche previously. But things have changed a little bit. Let's start with the coupe specifically. Now, these are sort of 130k upwards list depending on options, and when they were first launched, you saw prices pushing 200k for those folk trying to flip them. But take a look now, they are back down to list price, and I think they'll hold about there, maybe drop a little bit further, but there's a lot for sale here. And I think those that you see here that are for sale above 150k are going to be sat there for a long time, purely because there's cheaper cars out there, cars that offer better value. And also I've started to hear a few little reports of cars struggling in that the engines have failed. Oil pressure loss, oil pump failure, and engine pretty much grenading itself, which is not an ideal situation for some of these cars to be in. And we know that Porsche have always had issues here and there with their cars and the engines, rod failures, IMS failures, etc. So this is not necessarily anything new. Of course, they're highly stressed cars. They need a lot of oil, so you've got to check your oil is very well topped up on these. I know they drink a lot of oil, but another thing that could be potentially impacting the values here. As I said, you needed to have history for one of these cars previously, and I think this was true for the GT4 RS. For Spider RSs, I know folk who have had no previous buying history who've been able to get themselves a slot. So this is something that has changed, an RS car for people who haven't previously had a slot. And I think this is twofold, the reasons for this. First of which is there simply isn't necessarily the demand. Number two is dealers have been asked, something I've heard, to offer cars to people who haven't necessarily been on board previously. And the reason for this is to get the new conveyor belt of excited GT owners into the market. Of course, they have to realize that the people that do buy GT cars tend to be older, have had a lot of buying history with Porsche, but those guys aren't going to be around forever. So what happens after this? You need to get a new order book flowing for these customers. So getting new folk on board is a good thing from a marketing perspective, and to get customers started on that GT ownership journey. Hopefully they'll stay GT customers for a long time. So that could be the other thing that we are seeing here. Now, let's flip over to the 911. Now I have to say the 911 for me is still probably the most beautifully designed car ever. When I sit there and I think about all the cars that I think look great, and there is a lot of cars that I think look absolutely beautiful, the 911 for me is just a design masterpiece. It looks amazing. I'm probably going to get shot for saying this, but I do struggle with the concept of a 911 GT car and the limited availability of said models, because the 911 is so omnipresent on the roads. I appreciate it's still a niche car. It's still not something that you see everywhere, but the 911, they've made a lot of them, so you do see more of these, I think, on the roads than any other sports car or stroke super car. And this for me just takes down the peg or two the limitedness of a GT car in the 911 variant. Now you can't get a Ferrari F39, for example, that looks like an F40 but with slightly less power and more widespread availability. The F40, super limited, super sought after now, beautiful car, still one of my favorite cars of all time, but really, really, really rare, okay? 911s to look at are not rare. For sure, the GT cars, they have design cues, you've got a big wing on the back quite often, and they're harder to buy. But to the average folk on the street, it just looks like another 911. This is why I struggle a little bit with these variants of the cars, albeit the GT2 RS still being my favourite variant of the 911. But look at what's happening to prices here. Let's start with the last GT2 RS that was made. That is, of course, the 991 variant. And yes, these cars are still going for significantly over list. I believe the list was about 208,000 in the UK, but you're pushing 300k there or thereabouts for a good one in the UK market still. And these cars, super limited, absolutely really limited, really sought after. And of course, prices reflecting that. But prices are trending down slowly. So they're coming down. It's not a piece you can buy now and expect to make money on. I think they've got further to fall. This is the thing, they've got further to fall. And of course, you might get to a point when they bottom out and start to rise again, which is the curve that you would expect to see. But my advice would be to not get on board with the GT2 RS right now if you have money to burn, because you're going to potentially, in fact, pretty much certainly lose money on that. Now, if we rewind a little bit more and look back, still staying on that GT2 focus, let's look at the 997 variant there, about 150k for a GT2. Now, this is not an RS. They did make an RS in that, but it was really, really rare, and I can't find any for sale, but I believe if you do find one for sale, you're probably still going to be looking at 200k plus for one of those cars. Now, the 991 was the first variant where they only made a GT2 RS. You couldn't just get a GT2, so they're all RSs and therefore all very, very limited. But this for me is a car that I think will always do pretty well in terms of not losing you a ton of money. All right. It's a car that is very sought after, the GT2 very sought after. And how do you get a build slot on a GT2 RS? Well, I think it's always going to be the case that you will need significant buying history with Porsche. Nobody is walking in off the street and getting a slot for one of these cars. GT3s, on the other hand, yes, I think you can walk in off the street now and get yourself a build slot pretty easily on these cars. And potentially, would we see this with GT3 RSs? This is a question. I think we may well see that at some point in the future. GT3 RS is still going for overs, absolutely deservedly so. Of course, the last variant of that is the 992. And if you look at prices here, they are still very strong. The RS variants still really holding their own in terms of those values, which is really good to see and helps to give buyers the confidence that those cars are not necessarily going to tank too much in money. And of course, they absolutely won't, because they are very good cars indeed. So what does this mean going forwards? Well, GT cars from Porsche have always been very sought after, and they will continue to be very sought after. Now, I do think Porsche are going to see a little bit of pressure in the mid to long term with these cars.
And don't forget to kindly like and sub. Thank you very much.
And the reason for this is consumer sentiment at the moment. A little bit more risk averse, not necessarily taking the plunge on a GT car, waiting to see what happens with prices. And of course, you'll see this in the market, that prices will slowly tick down as people have cars in their books that they want to get rid of. And potentially even those folk who are hoping to flip their cars, all of a sudden flooding them to market to try and get the best price possible for them right now whilst they can. So this is something that you might see. And of course, we had the Taycan GT as well. And this was the first time I'd ever seen a GT car that was offered for less than list at new to get them off the forecourts. This to me completely unheard of, and this just goes to show that a Taycan GT is still a really challenging concept to swallow for those who prefer a traditional petrol GT car. The Taycan GT hoping to appeal to a new market, and yes, you know, I got a slot for one of those, but I turned it down. I'm glad I did, given prices where they're at now. But yeah, this was a really risky proposition from a marketing perspective for Porsche, and it didn't work out as planned. So this is the reality of where we're at right now with Porsche GT cars. Is the bubble about to burst? Highly unlikely, but we're going to see increased pressure on prices with the GT cars and even the RSs in the near to mid term, just while the market sorts itself out. And of course, as electric cars become more the norm, it may further hamper the demand for these cars as people find that the conversion from a price perspective just makes a little bit more sense. Moving over to EV platforms just makes a little bit more sense. But I think the GT cars are always going to be well represented in people's hearts. The demand for them is always going to be present. It is always going to be there. The petrol heads will keep the dream alive. And that's it for this one, D Stay Safe. I'll see you on the next one, and bye for now.